They think I don't see it. They think the old man's eyes, clouded with age, and what they assume is sentimentality, are too foggy to notice the quick, hungry glances, the calculating smiles, the way their voices get a little too sweet, like milk on the verge of turning. They think him just a vault waiting to be cracked, a will waiting to be read, a fortune waiting to be divided. They're not entirely wrong, but oh, how spectacularly they are wrong about the combination to that vault. My name is Liam, and I built an empire from mud and willpower. I didn't come from money, I came from the kind of poverty that leaves a permanent chill in your bones. I remember the gnawing emptiness in my belly, the way my mother's hands were raw and cracked from taking in other people's washing, the shame of patched trousers. That hunger, that shame, it forged me. It made me ruthless in business, sharp-eyed for an opportunity, and utterly unforgiving of laziness and entitlement. I made my fortune in property, in buying what was broken and forgotten, and seeing what it could become. I suppose, in a way, that's what I'm doing now. One last project. My family, such as it is a collection of vultures who've never known a day of real want. My son, Alistair, my only child, is a spineless wonder, more interested in his golf handicap and his third wife's shopping sprees than he ever was in building something that lasted. His children, my grandchildren, are worse. Mark, with his slicked back hair and his talk of portfolio diversification, who wouldn't know a hard day's work if it bit him on his tailored posterior. Sarah, all designer clothes and brittle smiles, who married that idiot financier. Thomas, a man with the moral compass of a weather vane in a hurricane. And then there's little Emily, Alistair's daughter from his second mess of a marriage. She's quieter, less overtly avaricious, but she's here, isn't she? Sitting in the corner of my drawing room, sipping her tea, her eyes taking inventory of every antique clock and Persian rug. They're all waiting for me to die. And I have decided to give them a show. It began, this final act of mine, about a year ago. The doctor, a serious young man with kind eyes, had just left. The news was what I expected. The machinery was winding down. It wasn't imminent. But the horizon was no longer a distant, abstract line. It was there, clear and sharp. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair, the one that had molded itself to my frame over 40 years, looking out at the gardens I'd planted with my dear Eleanor. She's been gone a decade now, and not a day passes I don't miss her ferocious intelligence and her gentle heart. She was the only one who ever truly saw me, who loved the man, not the bank account. She'd have hated what our family has become. That afternoon, the silence in the house was heavy, punctuated only by the ponderous ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a silence of absence, of things ending, and I found I wasn't ready for that kind of quiet. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted it. She'd have wanted mischief. A smile, the first real one in weeks, touched my lips. A plan, audacious and petty and perfect, began to form in my mind. It was a seed, and I would water it with the greed of my own blood. The centerpiece of my little drama needed to be an object. It had to be something that could plausibly be the key to everything, yet be utterly worthless. It had to be something I could convincingly dote on, and I knew exactly what it was. In a small, locked drawer of my desk, buried under old ledgers and letters from Eleanor, was a small tin token. It was about the size of a half-crown, tarnished and bent. On one side, it was stamped with a faded, crude image of a star. On the other, the wording was almost worn smooth, but I knew it by heart, good for one lucky break. I won it at a carnival the summer I was 12. I'd spent my last penny on the ring toss, trying to win a Cupid doll for a girl with freckles across her nose. I failed. The carney, a tired-looking man with grease under his fingernails, took pity on me and pressed this token into my hand. For luck, kid, Head grunted. I carried it in my pocket 4 years. A silly, superstitious touchstone. It was in my pocket the day I closed my first real estate deal. Eleanor always said it was our secret charm. Its value was purely sentimental, and its sentiment was mine alone. To anyone else, it was junk. I took it out, polished it with my thumb until the star gleamed dully, and placed it on the desk in front of me. Yes, this would do nicely. The transformation of Liam, the shrewd, unsentimental businessman, into Liam, the doting, slightly senile old man, began the next Sunday. The family had descended for their weekly pilgrimage, a ritual of false concern and thinly veiled interrogation. Cook had laid out a splendid tea, cucumber sandwiches, scones with clotted cream and jam, a rich fruitcake. They were all there, picking at the food, making inane chatter. I waited for a lull in the conversation. Then, with a hand I made sure trembled just slightly, I reached into the waistcoat pocket of my old tweed suit. I didn't say anything at first. I just pulled out the token and laid it on the linen tablecloth beside my china plate. I stared at it with what I hoped was a look of profound, tender reverence. The conversation didn't stop immediately. Sarah was droning on about some gallery opening, but eyes began to flicker. Thomas first. He has a predator's instinct for anything that glitters, even dully. Then Marks. Alistair, my oblivious son, was the last to notice, too busy eyeing the last scone. "What's that, father?" Alistair asked around a mouthful of crumbs. "Medal from the old days." I cupped my hand around it protectively, a gesture utterly foreign to my usual nature. "Oh, this. Nothing for you to worry about." My voice was softer, more wistful than my usual gruff bark. "Just an old friend." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her socialite's brain whirring. "It looks ancient, Grandad. Is it valuable?" I gave a slow, secretive smile. "You could say that. Its value is beyond price." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. "It's the cornerstone of it all, really." The key to what?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual, but failing to mask his sudden interest. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table. I looked at each of them, meeting their greedy, suddenly alert gazes. I let the silence stretch, drawing out the moment. "To everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Then I gave a little shake of my head, as if catching myself saying too much. I chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "But listen to me." An old man rambling about his trinkets. "Pay me no mind. Sarah, you were saying about the artist. The one who uses what was it? Cow dung." The subject was officially changed, but the hook was set. I could feel the change in the room's atmosphere. The air, once thick with boredom and obligation, was now crackling with a new, electric curiosity. They didn't look at me anymore, they looked at the pocket, where I had slowly, carefully, returned the token. I had thrown a single, worthless pebble into the pond, and the ripples were already beginning to spread. In the weeks that followed, I nurtured the myth with the care of a master gardener. I became forgetful, leaving the token in plain sight on my desk, only to panic moments later and scour the room for it, muttering about losing everything. I had my solicitor, a fiercely loyal man named Arthur Graves, who has been with me for 40 years, and who enjoys a well-executed bit of theatre as much as I do, come to the house for meetings. I would make sure a family member was within earshot. "Graves," I'd say, my voice carrying from the study into the hall where Sarah was no doubt admiring a vase. "The arrangements for the decor assets, are they all in place?" "The instructions are clear. It must be handled personally. No banks, no safety deposit boxes. The key is the key, you understand." Graves, to his credit, played his part beautifully. "Of course, Mr. O'Connell. The protocols are explicit and irrevocable. Everything is tied to the item's verification. It is the linchpin." We spoke in this ridiculous, coded language, and I could all but hear Sarah's ears burning on the other side of the door. The phrase core assets was a particular favorite of mine. It sounded so substantial, so financial. I began to weave vague anecdotes into conversation. Sitting by the fire in the evening, I'd stare into the flames and say, apropos of nothing, "I remember when old Seamus Orley tried to buy it from me. 1973, it was. Offered me £10,000 on the spot. 10,000. I laughed in his face, told him he couldn't afford the interest it had earned me that week. It was a complete fabrication, of course. I'd never known a Seamus Orley, but the story contained tantalizing details, a huge sum of money for the time, the concept of it earning interest, The family's behavior began to shift. Their weekly visits became more frequent. They started dropping by midweek, alone, with flimsy excuses. I was just in the neighborhood. Grandfather thought he'd pop in for a cup of tea. They'd bring me little gifts, expensive cigars, a new brandy, and steer the conversation, with all the subtlety of a bulldozer, towards the past, towards my early investments. Mark was the most clumsy. He brought over a biography of J.P. Morgan and pointed to a section about how the great financier used a special artifact as a good luck charm for major deals. Fascinating stuff, Grandad had said, his eyes glued to my face, watching for a reaction. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, if the greatest fortunes often have a tangible symbol, a focus point. I gave him a blank, milky-eyed stare. Morgan knew a Morgan once, ran a pub in Dublin. Terrible poor. Watered down the Guinness, the scoundrel. Mark's smile became a rigid, frustrated mask. Sarah and Thomas took a different tack. They brought their two obnoxious children, a boy and a girl who had been taught to be precocious, but were merely badly behaved. The children would clamber onto my lap, a thing they had never done before, and ask, in rehearsed-sounding tones, "Great-Grandad, will you tell us a story about the Lucky Star?" I'd tell them a story, all right. I'd tell them a long, rambling, and utterly boring story about the carnival where I won it, describing the smell of fried dough and the sound of the calliope music in meticulous detail, carefully omitting any mention of its actual worthlessness. It watched Sarah's smile tighten as her plan to extract information through her children failed spectacularly. Only Emily was different. She didn't ask. She just watched. She'd sit there, a quiet, observant mouse in the corner, her eyes missing nothing. It was unnerving, in a way. While the others were sharks in a feeding frenzy, she was a deep-sea fish, watching from the dark, and I couldn't quite tell what she was thinking. The climax of this first act of my play arrived on a cold, blustery day in November. I had decided to move the token. The drama needed escalation. I made a great show of being unsettled all day, jumping at noises, peering out the windows. I told Mrs. Higgins, my housekeeper, that I thought he'd seen a suspicious character lurking by the garden gate. "Probably just a journalist, sir," she said. A wonderfully practical woman who thought I was becoming eccentric, but humoured me. After a story about the great Liam O'Connell. "No, no," I said, wringing my hands, a gesture I had been practicing. This was different. He had a covetous look. I all but hugged myself. "I must move it. It's not safe here anymore." I made sure to say this just as Alistair was arriving. Had come to borrow a bottle of my best port, a common enough occurrence. "Move what, father?" he asked, already making a beeline for the drinks cabinet. "Nothing. It's nothing," I said, with a splendid display of agitation. I hurried into my study and made a point of locking the door. I waited a full minute, then unlocked it and emerged, looking relieved. I patted my waistcoat pocket. "Safe," I muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. Alistair looked at me, a bottle of 45 grams in his hand, a faint frown on his face. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't just avarice or boredom. It might have been concern, or perhaps it was just confusion that the vault was behaving erratically. "You're acting strange, father. Are you feeling quite all right?" "Never better," I chirped, my voice unnaturally high. "The port's on the left, son. Don't take the 45. Take the 62. It's for a special occasion." I was laying it on thick, but Alistair was never the brightest. He just shrugged, swapped the bottles, and left with a vague wave, already thinking about his dinner. The stage was set. The bait was not only laid out, but it just announced it was being moved. The vultures were circling lower now. That night, I prepared the token for its new home. I didn't just put it somewhere. I created a production. I went down to the cellar, to the old, original part of the house that predated my renovations. It was cold, damp, and lined with dusty wine racks and forgotten storage trunks. In the farthest, darkest corner, behind a crate of mildewed books, was an old, disused fireplace, bricked up decades ago. One of the bricks was loose, With a great deal of grunting and theatrical sighing, I worked the brick free. I took the token and I placed it not in the hole, but first into a small, velvet drawstring bag, the kind that might hold a piece of jewelry. Then I placed the bag into a small, polished wooden box that had once held a pair of cufflinks from Eleanor. Then, and only then, did I place the box into the cavity behind the brick. I pushed the brick back into place, making sure it was just slightly askew, not quite flush with the others. A tell, a beacon for a greedy eye. I dusted off my hands, a triumphant smile on my face in the dark cellar. Let them find it. Let them think they've discovered the secret of the universe. Let them steal it. The next part of the plan required a departure. I announced at Sunday lunch that I was feeling the chill of the season and was going to spend a few weeks at my cottage in the south of France. The doctor says the sun will do me good, I said, affecting a cough. The reaction was instantaneous and poorly concealed panic. France, Mark blurted out. But who will look after the house, Mrs. Higgins will be here, I said mildly. And the security system is excellent. Not that there's anything here anyone would want. I took a sip of water, my eyes innocent. It's all quite safe. The looks they exchanged were a symphony of avarice and anxiety. Safe. The core asset was here, and the old man was leaving it unguarded. The thought was written plainly on their faces. The day before my flight, I summoned them all. I told them I had an important announcement. They gathered in the drawing room, their pastures tense, their eyes bright with anticipation. Perhaps I was finally going to explain the will. Perhaps I was going to reveal the secret of the token. I stood before them, leaning on my cane. I looked at their faces, each one a mask of feigned concern and naked greed. My children, my legacy. I've been doing a lot of thinking, I began, my voice slow and deliberate, about the future, about what happens after. They leaned forward, a perfectly synchronized display of rapt attention. If decided, I said, pausing for effect, that the hydrangeas by the south wall are looking terribly ragged. When I get back from France, I'm having them all dug up and replaced with rose bushes. Eleanor always loved roses. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the Persian rug. Their faces cycled through confusion, frustration, and finally, a forced, brittle agreeableness. Of course, Father, Alistair said, his voice strained. Whatever you think best. Lovely, Sarah whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped her handbag. I smiled benevolently at them all. Good. That's settled then. I was enjoying this far too much. Well, I must finish packing. Safe travels home, everyone. I turned and left them there, sitting in the silent, opulent room, stewing in their own avarice and confusion. The safe was leaving. The combination was hidden somewhere in the house. The race was on. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the whispering start behind me, low and urgent. The game was afoot. My flight wasn't for another 36 hours. I had no intention of going to France, of course. I had a room booked at a small, discreet hotel in town. I was going to watch. I had cameras installed tiny. Hidden things in the cellar, in the study, in the hall. Graves was going to monitor the feeds. We were going to have a fine old time. I reached the landing and paused, looking down at the grand hallway below. They began to emerge from the drawing room, their faces carefully recomposed into masks of familiar warmth. Have a wonderful trip, Grandad, Mark said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Well, miss you, Sarah added, air kissing my cheek. They filed out, one by one, into the grey afternoon. I stood there until I heard the last car engine fade away. The house was silent again, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence before the storm. I walked into my bedroom and opened the wardrobe. My suitcase was there, half packed. On top of my folded sweaters lay the small velvet bag. I took out the token and held it in my palm. The cheap, tarnished tin gleamed in the weak light from the window. All right, my old friend, I murmured, a true smile, sharp and cold, finally spreading across my face. Let's see what luck you bring them. The silence after they left was profound, but it was no longer the quiet of an empty house. It was the charged, breathless hush of a stage after the actors have exited, waiting for the next, more clandestine scene to begin. I stood at my bedroom window, the cold glass against my fingertips, and watched the last of their car's Thomas obnoxious silver sports car disappear down the long, tree-lined drive. The performance was over. The surveillance was about to begin. I had no intention of going to France. The cottage there was real and lovely, but it was a place for happy memories with Eleanor, not for staging the final unraveling of my wretched family. Instead, I had booked the bridal suite at the Queen's Arms, a stuffy, old-fashioned hotel in town that prided itself on discretion and a well-stocked whiskey bar. Arthur Graves was due to arrive within the hour with the monitoring equipment. We were going to have a ringside seat to the greatest show on earth, or at least the greatest show in Westchester. I finished packing my suitcase with a few necessities, a deliberate act of misdirection for Mrs. Higgins. I needed her to believe I was truly leaving. I carried it downstairs and left it by the front door. -1 have a car come for me at 6 tomorrow morning, Mrs. H. I announced, making sure my voice carried a slight wheeze. In for an early night, I think. The travel wears me out these days. Of course, Mr. O'Connell, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. She gave me a look that was a mixture of concern and suspicion. Mrs. Higgins has been with me for 25 years. She's sharp. She knew something was afoot, but her loyalty was to me, not to the pack of hyenas that were my bloodline. She'd play her part, or set the alarms before I leave for the evening. Thank you, my dear, I said, and patted her arm. The place is in your capable hands. An hour later, a discreet black sedan pulled up. Arthur Graves got out, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that looked more fit for stock certificates than for espionage gear. He was a tall, gaunt man with a perpetually serious expression, but there was a glint in his eye that told me he was looking forward to this as much as I was. Head being my solicitor, my confidant, and the executor of my will for 4 decades. Had seen the family's avarice up close, and had long since lost any patience for them. Liam, he said, nodding as I let him in. The players have taken their leave, with their tails firmly between their legs, though they don't know it yet, I chuckled. The stage is set. Is the equipment ready? State of the art, he said, opening the briefcase on the hall table. Inside, nestled in custom foam, was a compact laptop and a series of small wireless receivers for cameras, high definition, night vision, motion-activated recording. One in the cellar, focused on the brickwork. One in the study, covering the desk and the door. One in the main hall, and one on the landing upstairs for a wider view. The feeds are encrypted and will stream to this laptop and to a cloud server. We'll see everything. We spent the next hour being furtive, 2 old men playing at spies. Arthur, surprisingly agile for his years, placed the tiny cameras with practiced efficiency. The one in the cellar was the most clever, hidden within the hollow of a dusty, old clay jug on a shelf that had a perfect view of the bricked-up fireplace. The one in the study was embedded in the frame of a painting of a particularly dour ancestor, his eyes providing a perfect vantage point. It felt absurd and thrilling. Eleanor would have laughed herself sick. By the time we were finished, the winter afternoon was fading into an early, purple dusk. We left the house, me with my suitcase, a perfect picture of a man going on a journey. Mrs. Higgins had already gone for the day. I set the alarm and locked the door with a final, satisfying click. Let them try to beat a system I personally designed and paid a fortune for. It would be the first of many expensive lessons they were about to learn. The Queen's Arms was as fusty and comfortable as an old slipper. We ordered a bottle of single malt and a plate of sandwiches to the suite, and Arthur set up the laptop on the writing desk. The 4 camera feeds glowed on the screen, showing empty, still life views of my home. The cellar was dark and shadowy, the night vision casting it in a ghostly green monochrome. The house looked peaceful, innocent. It was anything but. It was a trap. Now, I said, settling into a worn velvet armchair with a glass of whiskey. We wait. I didn't have to wait long. The first motion alert chimed on the laptop, 9:17 p.m. that very night. Arthur, who had been dozing in his chair, jerked awake. I leaned forward, my heart giving a little thump of anticipation. The feed showing the main hallway flickered to life. The front door was opening, but the alarm hadn't sounded. A figure, dressed in dark clothing and wearing slim leather gloves, slipped inside, moving with a practiced, silent grace. It was Sarah. She didn't fumble for a light. She used a small penlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. She moved with a purpose that was both shocking and impressive. My granddaughter, the socialite, was a proficient cat burglar. She went straight to the alarm panel by the door and, with a few quick taps, disarmed it completely. She knew the code. Of course she did. She'd watched me enter it a dozen times. Her eyes, I now realized, never missing a thing. Well, I'll be damned, Arthur whispered, a note of professional respect in his voice. She's good. She's a thief, I said. But I couldn't keep a sliver of perverse pride out of my voice. She had her grandfather's nerve, if not his morals. She didn't linger. She knew right where she was going. She bypassed the drawing room, the study, all the places where obvious valuables were kept. Her penlight beam led her unerringly towards the cellar door. She disappeared from the whole camera's view. A moment later, the green-hued feed from the cellar camera showed the door opening and her slender figure descending the stairs. She went directly to the bricked-up fireplace. She didn't hesitate. She didn't search. She knew. She must have had someone watching the house, or perhaps she'd managed to plant a device of her own earlier. She ran her gloved hands over the bricks until her light settled on the one that was slightly proud of the others. With a small grunt of effort, she worked it loose. There, in the cavity, was the wooden box. She pulled it out, and even on the grainy night vision feed, I could see the tremor of excitement in her hands. She didn't open it there. She clutched it to her chest, like a holy relic, replaced the brick with hurried movements, and scurried back up the stairs. She reset the alarm, slipped out the front door, and was gone, swallowed by the night. The whole operation had taken less than 5 minutes. Arthur let out a long, low whistle. The core asset has been liberated. I took a slow sip of my whiskey. The peat smoke taste a comforting anchor. Phase 1, complete. Shall open it. Shall see it's a piece of junk. And then the real fun begins. What do you mean? Arthur asked. She's smart. Shall realize that a worthless token can't be the real key. Shall conclude that her discovery was too easy, that it was a decoy, that the real key must still be hidden somewhere else in the house. Her greed won't let her believe otherwise. Shall be back, and she won't be the only one. I was right. The next night, the motion alerts began again just after midnight. This time, it was the study camera that triggered. The door eased open and Mark stepped inside. He was less elegant than his sister. He was dressed in a dark tracksuit, and he was sweating, his face a mask of nervous tension. He went straight to my desk and began rifling through the drawers, his movements frantic and clumsy. He was looking for a hidden compartment, a false bottom, anything. He pulled out papers, old photographs, ledgers, scattering them in his haste. He had no finesse, only a blundering, entitled desperation. He spent nearly half an hour tearing the study apart before he gave up. Slumping into my chair, wiping his brow, he looked defeated. Then his eyes, caught clearly by the camera in the painting's frame, narrowed. A new idea dawned on his stupid, handsome face. He got up and left the study, heading upstairs. The camera on the landing caught him entering my bedroom. We heard, through the camera's sensitive microphone, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the thump of shoes being thrown aside as he searched the wardrobe. He was still up there when another alert chimed. The front door feed showed it opening again. It was Thomas, Sarah's husband, alone this time. He was a large man, and he moved with a bullish lack of grace, bumping into a side table and cursing under his breath. He was clearly not in on his wife's successful mission the previous night. He was on his own freelance looting operation. He didn't go to the cellar. He made a beeline for the library, for the shelves of rare first editions he'd collected over a lifetime. He wasn't interested in the words, he was interested in the value. He began pulling down volume after volume, shaking them, looking for loose papers, for a hidden safe behind the books. He was a Philistine, and it was painful to watch him manhandle a first edition Dickens. Upstairs, Mark must have heard the noise. The landing camera showed him emerging from my bedroom, his head cocked. He crept to the top of the stairs and peered down. He saw Thomas in the library, his back turned. The look on Mark's face was a priceless mixture of outrage and territorial fury. How dare this outsider, this interloper by marriage, beat him to the prize? Mark descended the stairs with a deliberate, quiet tread. He stood in the library doorway, arms crossed. "Looking for something, Thomas," he said, his voice cold. Thomas jumped, whirling around, a copy of Great Expectations held like a weapon in his hand. His face flushed a deep, guilty red. "Mark, Jesus, you scared me. I thought I heard a noise. A break-in. I was checking." "A break-in," Mark repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And you decided to investigate by ransacking grandfather's first editions. Very public-spirited of you. Well, what are you doing here?" Thomas shot back, recovering some of his bluster. "I don't see you wearing a security guard's uniform." "This is my family's house," Mark said, puffing out his chest. "I have a right to be here. You're just married to the help." It was a low blow, and it hit its mark. Thomas' face darkened with anger. "You pompous little shit. You're no better than the rest of us. You're here for the same reason I am." They stood there, two grown men in the middle of the night, squaring off over a fortune either of them had earned, in a house that wasn't theirs, both completely unaware that the object of their desire was currently sitting in Sarah's dressing room, inside its little box, its worthlessness already dawning on her. "This is better than the cinema," Arthur murmured, refilling his glass. The standoff was broken by the sound of a key in the front door. Both men froze, their eyes wide with panic. The door opened and Alistair walked in. "My son." He was wearing his dressing gown and carpet slippers, and he looked confused and half asleep. He fumbled for the light switch, flooding the hall and library with light, blinding the two intruders. "What in God's name is going on in here?" Alistair demanded, his voice trembling with a confusion that was almost certainly genuine. "Mark, Thomas, what are you doing?" The two men stumbled over each other with excuses, a jumbled mess of checking on things and heard a noise, and just making sure everything was secure. Alistair, to his credit, looked utterly bewildered. He wasn't in on the hunt. He was just a lazy man who'd been woken from his sleep and had come to investigate the house he stood to inherit, worried someone was stealing his future property before he'd even gotten his hands on it. "Well, everything seems fine," Alistair said, rubbing his eyes. "The alarm was off. Did one of you turn it off? That's very irresponsible. There's silverware in here worth a fortune." The sheer absurdity of it, the two of them being scolded for disabling the alarm so they could rob the place more effectively, was almost too much to bear. Arthur had to stifle a laugh with his handkerchief. Eventually, Alistair, playing the patriarch, shooed them both out, reset the alarm with a code he obviously knew, and locked up after them. He stood for a moment in the hall, looking around with a puzzled expression, then shook his head and left, locking the door behind him. The house was quiet again, but it was a scene of minor devastation. The study was a mess. The library looked like it had been hit by a tornado. My bedroom had been violated. I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. This was what they were. Without the constraints of society and my watchful eye, they were just common thieves, and clumsy ones at that. The family name, the legacy he'd built, meant nothing to them. It was just an obstacle between them and a payday. The following days were a parade of similar farces. They came at all hours, alone and in shifting, distrustful alliances. Sarah returned, her face a mask of frustration, and conducted an even more thorough search of the cellar, convinced the real item was still there. Mark and Thomas, their partnership forged in mutual suspicion, came together one night, a hilarious and silent duo, methodically tapping walls for hollow spaces. Emily, my quiet granddaughter, even made an appearance. She didn't rifle or search. She simply walked through the rooms, her expression unreadable, running a finger over the dust on a mantelpiece, staring at the portrait of Eleanor in the drawing room. She left after 10 minutes, having touched nothing. I couldn't figure her out, and that bothered me. The pièce de résistance occurred 4 days into my trip. I received a call from my security company. There had been a trigger on the panic button, the one hidden under my desk. The police had been dispatched. Arthur and I watched, Liv, as the police officers entered the study with their torches drawn to find Alistair and Thomas in a literal wrestling match on the Persian rug. They were red-faced, grunting, rolling around on the floor, each trying to pry a small, carved jade figurine from the other's hands. They had both, independently, decided it must be the real key and had converged on it at the same time. The looks on the policemen's faces were worth every penny of the fortune it spent on this enterprise. The excuses were pathetic, humiliating. The family's dirty laundry was aired in the most public and undignified way possible. It made the local paper's police blotter. Disturbance on Elmwood Drive. To men involved in a dispute over home decor. I had Arthur trim the clipping. After a week, the nocturnal visits ceased. The house was a shambles, but the players had retreated to lick their wounds and, no doubt, to plot their next moves. The initial fever of greed had broken, replaced by a simmering paranoia and mutual hatred. They had all been in that house, hunting the same thing, getting in each other's way. The trust, what little there had been, was now utterly shattered. It was time for the grand finale. The curtain had to fall. I sent a message to them all, through Arthur. Mr. O'Connell returns tomorrow. He requests the presence of the entire family for dinner at 7 o'clock. He has important matters to discuss. The stage was set for the last act. I went back to the hotel room and retrieved the token from its velvet bag. I held it one last time. The carnival token. The worthless piece of tin. It had performed its role magnificently. It had laid bare the true characters of my heirs. It had cost them their dignity and their peace of mind. It was the most valuable worthless object in the world. I slipped it back into my waistcoat pocket. I would wear it for the performance. A final, triumphant flourish. The next evening, I arrived home precisely at 6. Mrs. Higgins had been in to clean, but the signs of the violation were still there. A scuff on the desk, a book out of place in the library, a faint bruise on the hallway wallpaper where Thomas had stumbled into it. Perfect. At 7 o'clock on the dot, the doorbell began to ring. They arrived one by one, each wearing a mask of strained normality. Alistair, looking tired and irritable. Mark, with a bruise on his cheek from his tussle with Thomas. Sarah, her smile brittle and her eyes haunted. Thomas, sullen and defensive. And Emily, last as always, quiet, watchful, her gaze lingering on my face. Dinner was a stilt, agonizing affair. The conversation was forced, a series of pleasantries that landed like lead balloons. They couldn't look at each other. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and shared humiliation. They picked at Mrs. Higgins' excellent roast beef, their appetites gone. They were waiting for me to speak, waiting for the revelation. I drew the meal out, torturing them. I talked about the weather in France. I talked about the food. I asked Mark about his golf, Sarah about her children, Thomas about the markets. They answered in monosyllables, their patience stretched to breaking point. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared away, I dabbed my mouth with my napkin and leaned back in my chair. A sudden, absolute silence fell over the table. All eyes were on me. The moment had come. I trust you've all been well, I began, my voice calm and steady, all trace of the feeble old man gone. I must say, the time away gave me a great deal of clarity, helped me see things for what they truly are. I reached slowly into my waistcoat pocket. I saw them all stiffen. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Mark's knuckles were white on the tablecloth. This was it, the reveal, the key. I pulled out the token and placed it on the table beside my wine glass. It lay there, a small, tarnished, pathetic circle of metal. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. They just stared at it, their faces a kaleidoscope of confusion, recognition, and dawning horror. This, I said, my voice ringing in the silent room, this little thing. It's caused quite a stir, hasn't it? Alistair was the first to break. Father, what is this? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the core assets, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. The key to everything. The linchpin of the entire fortune. The object you've all been tearing my house apart in the dead of night to find. The blood drained from Sarah's face. Mark looked like he'd been slapped. Thomas sank lower in his chair. I know about the visits, I continued, my tone conversational, as if discussing the stock market. I know about the searches, the disarmed alarms, the police incident. I have it all on film, actually. Quite entertaining, in a tragic sort of way. You, Sarah, were surprisingly efficient and natural. Mark, you were as subtle as a ball in a china shop. And Thomas wrestling my son on the rug for a jade ornament. Really, the humiliation in the room was a physical force. They couldn't meet my eyes. But you were all looking for this, I said, picking up the token and holding it between my thumb and forefinger. This was the prize, the source of all the mystery. Go on, take a closer look. I tossed it. It skittered across the polished tabletop and came to a rest in front of Sarah. She flinched as if it were a spider. Pick it up, I commanded, my voice losing its pleasant tone and turning to steel. With a trembling hand, she did. She turned it over. She saw the crude star, the faded wording, good for one lucky break. Her face, pale before, was now ashen with the dawning, awful comprehension. What is it? Mark whispered. It's a token from a carnival ring toss, I said, my voice flat and cold. Circa 1952. I won it. Or rather, it was given to me out of pity after I lost. It's worth less than the dirt under your fingernails. It is, and always has been, completely and utterly worthless. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a dream dying, of avarice curdling into shame. But you said, Alistair stammered. The key, the cornerstone. I said a lot of things, I interrupted. I played a senile old man clinging to his lucky charm. And you, my beloved family, you swallowed it whole. You revealed yourselves for what you are, a pack of greedy, conniving, ungrateful thieves. You didn't care about me. You didn't care about this family. You cared about the money. So I gave you something to chase, and you chased it right into a wall. I looked at each of them in turn, imprinting their shame onto my memory. The real assets, I said, slowly and clearly, the properties, the stocks, the bonds, the liquid capital, none of it is tied to this. It was never in this house. It's been managed by Arthur Graves for years, and the instructions in my will are very, very specific. I leaned forward, my gaze sweeping over their shattered faces. You get nothing. The silence in the dining room was absolute, a vacuum sucking all the sound and air out of the world. It was the silence of a bomb blast aftermath, where the ringing in your ears is the only thing left. They just stared, their faces frozen in a gallery of shock, their carefully constructed worlds of entitlement and avarice collapsing into dust around them. Sarah was the first to break. A small, choke sound escaped her lips, a half gasp, half sob. The token fell from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto her dessert plate, smearing itself in a streak of chocolate and raspberry coulis. A fitting end for something they'd all hungered for. She looked from the token to me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the utter, complete, and humiliating defeat she saw reflected in my gaze. Mark's face cycled through colors, first the white of shock, then the red of fury, settling on a blotchy, puce shade of pure, unadulterated rage. You set us up, he breathed, the words barely audible, laced with a venom he'd never heard from him before. You lied to us. You made us look like fools. I didn't make you do anything, Mark, I said, my voice cold and level. I dangled a piece of tin. You chose to become thieves. I merely provided the opportunity for you to reveal your true characters. And what a spectacular display it was. Thomas found his voice, a blustering, defensive roar. This is insane. You can't do this. There are laws. We're your family. You can't just cut us out. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. "You're a sick, old man. This is mental abuse. Well, contest it. Well, have you declared incompetent?" I didn't even flinch. I simply smiled, a thin, icy curve of my lips. "By all means, Thomas. Contest. I encourage it. My medical records are impeccable. My mental faculties, as you have just witnessed, are perfectly sound. Sharper, I'd wager, than yours. And Arthur Graves has documented every single one of your late-night excursions. The police report from your little wrestling match with my son is a matter of public record. Please, take me to court. I would relish the opportunity to play those security tapes for a judge. It would be the social event of the season." The fight drained out of him as quickly as it had arrived. He sank back into his chair, his bulk seeming to deflate, a balloon losing all its air. He knew he was beat. They all knew. Alistair was just broken. He looked old, older than he'd ever seen him. He wasn't angry or defensive. He was just profoundly sad and deeply ashamed. He kept his eyes on the tablecloth, tracing the pattern of the damask with a shaking finger. "Why, father?" he whispered. The question meant for no one. A quiet plea to the universe. Why would you do this to us? That was the question, wasn't it? The one that had been burning in me for years. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, and for the first time that evening, I let the raw, unfiltered truth pour out. Not the performative truth of my act, but the real, bitter core of it. "Why?" I repeated, my voice low but cutting through the room like a shard of glass. "Because you earned it, Alistair. All of you. You think I built this for you. This empire. This fortune. So you could squander it on fast cars and slow horses. So you could use it as a backdrop for your vacuous parties and your social climbing. I built it for me. I built it because I was hungry. I built it to prove that the boy from the tenements could own the tenements. It was my fight, my victory, not yours." I looked at Mark. "You never once asked me how I did it. You only ever asked me what you would get." I turned to Sarah. "You saw my houses as venues, my art as accessories. You never saw the work." My gaze landed on Thomas. "You saw a score, a piggy bank to be smashed open. Finally, I looked at my son. And you never had the fire. You were content to stand in the warmth of my blaze. But you never once tried to light one of your own. You were a custodian of wealth, not a builder of it. And a poor custodian at that." I pushed my chair back and stood up, needing to tower over them one last time. "This wasn't revenge. It was an audit. A final inspection. And you all failed. Spectacularly. You proved that the only thing you value, the currency. You have no concept of its cost. You don't deserve it." The finality in my voice was absolute. It was the sound of a vault door slamming shut forever. It was then that a small sound broke the silence. A soft, almost inaudible clinking. We all turned. Emily, who had been so quiet he'd almost forgotten she was there, was pushing her chair back. She had been crying, silent tears tracking through her makeup, but her face was not set in the shock or rage of the others. It was set in something else. Resignation. Relief. She didn't look at any of us. She walked slowly, deliberately, around the table until she stood beside Sarah. She looked down at the token, now lying in its bed of chocolate sauce. Without a word, she picked it up. She didn't flinch at the mess. She held it in her palm, her fingers closing around it. Then she turned and walked towards me. She stopped in front of me, her head bowed for a moment, before lifting her eyes to meet mine. They were clear and, to my astonishment, held no accusation. "I'm sorry, grandfather," she said, her voice steady and soft. "I'm sorry for what we became." Then she did something that utterly disarmed me. She took my hand, pried open my fingers, and placed a sticky, chocolate-smeared token squarely in my palm. She closed my fingers over it. "This is yours," she said. "Your luck, your memory. It never belonged to any of us." She gave my closed hand a gentle squeeze, then turned and walked out of the dining room. We heard the soft click of the front door opening and closing. She was gone. The room was left in a state of bewildered suspension. Her act, so simple and so profoundly dignified, had shamed them more deeply than any of my words ever could. It was the final, unanswerable argument. The spell was broken by Mark. He slammed his fist on the table, making the china jump. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice thick with humiliation and fury. He stood, threw his napkin on the table, and stormed out without another word. Thomas followed him, a beaten dog slinking after its master. Sarah just sat there, staring at the empty space where Emily had been. The tears were flowing freely now, but they were tears of self-pity, of a plan gone catastrophically wrong. She looked at me, her expression pleading for a shred of mercy. But finding none, Sheeta fled the room, her heels clicking a frantic, retreating tattoo on the hall floor. Only Alistair remained. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet. He looked ancient, burdened by a weight he could never lift. He didn't look at me. He just shuffled to the door, a broken man in a house that was no longer his. And then I was alone. The grand dining room, with its portraits and its crystal and its long mahogany table, was silent. The aftermath of the feast. I looked down at my hand. I uncurled my fingers. The token lay there, a pathetic, sticky mess. I walked to the sidebar, poured a measure of brandy into a glass, and took a long, burning swallow. The warmth spread through my chest, but it did nothing to thaw the cold, hollow feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I had won. I had exposed them, humiliated them, and stripped them of any claim to my life's work. It was everything I had wanted. It was a perfect, flawless victory. So why did I feel so empty? I walked through the quiet house, the scene of their crimes. I righted a book in the library. I smoothed a wrinkle in the rug in the study. I was the curator of a museum of my own making, and the exhibits were my family's failures. I ended up in the drawing room, in my armchair by the fire that Mrs. Higgins had lit. I stared into the flames, just as I had when he'd begun this whole charade. The token was still in my hand. I wiped the chocolate off on my handkerchief, revealing the tarnished tin and the faint stamp of the star. "For luck, kid," the carney had said. What was my luck? To live long enough to see my legacy become a curse, to die knowing that the name O'Connell would be synonymous with avarice and scandal after I was gone. I'd wanted to teach them a lesson, but the person who had learned the most was me. I had learned that in my quest to punish their greed, I had become a miser of the spirit, hoarding my disappointments and doling out bitterness as my final inheritance. Emily's face floated in my memory, her clear eyes, her simple words, "I'm sorry for what we became." She hadn't said what you made us. She had said what we became. She had accepted her share of the blame. In that moment, she had shown more grace and character than any of us. I sat there for a long time, as the fire burned down to embers. The house, my magnificent, empty mausoleum of a house, groaned and settled around me. I thought of Eleanor. What would she have thought of tonight? She would have been horrified by their behavior, yes, but she would have been heartbroken by mine. She would have said I was right, but that he'd chosen the cruelest way to prove it. She believed in building people up, not in tearing them down. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear the soft knock at the front door at first. It came again, a little louder. Frowning, I heaved myself out of the chair. Who could it be? They'd all fled. The press, perhaps, had news of the dinner already leaked. I opened the door. Emily stood there. She was holding a small, overnight bag. "I forgot something," she said simply. I stepped aside, too tired and too surprised to speak. She walked in, familiar and sure, and went not to the dining room or the study, but upstairs. I heard her footsteps overhead, moving towards the small guest room at the end of the hall, the one Shed always used as a girl. A few minutes later, she came back down. She was carrying a book, a worn, old copy of Jane Eyre. She held it up. "This was mine, from when I used to stay here." She walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the knob. She turned back to look at me. "I meant what I said, grandfather. I am sorry, but you were wrong about one thing tonight." I said, my voice rough. "What was that?" "You said none of us ever asked how you built it." She met my gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "I'm asking now. If you'd ever like to tell me." Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. I stood in the hall for a long time, staring at the closed door. The hollow feeling in my stomach was gone, replaced by a faint, fragile flicker of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The next morning, I called Arthur Graves. "Liam," he said, his voice cautious. How did the rest of the evening go?" "The will, Arthur," I said, without preamble. "We need to make a change." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "A change? Liam, after last night, are you sure? They'll contest it regardless, but if you start making amendments now, especially after that performance, I'm not leaving it to them," I said. "And I'm not leaving it to charity. I'm leaving it to her." "Her? Her who?" "Emily." Another silence, this one even longer and more profound. "Emily," he repeated, slowly. "You want to disinherit your son, your other grandchildren, and leave the entire estate to Emily. Liam, that is a nuclear option. The lawsuits will never end. They will tie it up in probate for a decade. They will destroy her, and what's left of the estate, with legal fees." "I know," I said. A plan was forming in my mind, a new one, better than the last. A plan for building, not destruction. "So we won't make it easy for them. We'll make it impossible. Listen carefully. This is what we're going to do." I spent the next hours on the phone with Arthur, weaving a new web, this one not of deceit, but of protection. The fortune would not be left to Emily in a simple bequest. That would indeed be a war. Instead, it would be placed into an ironclad, discretionary trust. Arthur would be the sole trustee. The trust would own everything: the companies, the properties, the assets. The O'Connell fortune would become a single, immutable entity, protected from being broken up and sold off. And the beneficiaries, they would all be beneficiaries. Alistair, Mark, Sarah, Thomas, even Emily. But they would not receive a lump sum. They would receive a stipend, a generous one, more than enough to live a life of comfort, but a pittance compared to the whole. It was an allowance, a permanent allowance. It would feed their lifestyles, but starve their ambitions. It would be a constant, monthly reminder that they were children who had failed the test, forever on the payroll, never masters of their own destiny. But for Emily, there was a key. The trust documents gave the trustee Arthur the power to appoint a successor from the bloodline, someone to eventually take over the management of the empire. To sit in the seat of power was vacating. It would be his decision, based on merit, on character, on a demonstrated understanding of what the fortune represented. It wouldn't be a gift, it would be a job offer, the hardest job interview of her life. And to make it absolutely, legally unassailable, I added one final, delicious clause, a in terrorem clause, a no-contest clause on steroids. It stated that any beneficiary who challenged the will or the trust in any way would have their stipend terminated immediately and permanently. They would be cut off, not by my hand from beyond the grave, but by their own. If they so much as filed a motion in court, they would lose everything. They would have to sit on their hands and accept their monthly check, seething with impotent rage, forever. "It's brilliant, Liam," Arthur said, and I could hear the admiration in his voice. "It's cruel, but it's brilliant. It gives them just enough to keep them from desperate measures, but not enough to satisfy them. It protects the capital, and it gives the girl a chance, a real chance, without just handing it to her." "Draw it up," I said. "I want it signed by the end of the week." I hung up the phone. The sun was streaming through the windows of my study. The house felt different, lighter. I had been an architect of ruin. Now, I would be an architect of a different sort. The following weeks were quiet. The family was licking its wounds, no doubt consulting their own lawyers and being told, in no uncertain terms, about the futility and financial suicide of challenging an in terrorem clause. The monthly stipends began, direct deposits into their accounts. A life sentence of comfortable mediocrity. I didn't see or hear from any of them, except for Emily. She started visiting, not for dinners, not for occasions. She would just show up on a Tuesday afternoon with a bag of groceries. "I thought it'd make you lunch," she'd say. And she would. Simple things. Soup and sandwiches. We would eat in the kitchen, not the dining room. At first, the conversations were stilted. We talked about the weather, about books, about nothing of consequence. But then, one afternoon, she asked about the token again. "You never did tell me," she said, washing the lunch dishes. "How did you do it? How did you start?" And so, I told her. I started at the beginning. The tenements, the hunger, the first job I'd gotten, sweeping out a butcher's shop for a few pennies. I told her about seeing my first for sale sign on a boarded up, rat-infested shell of a house and knowing, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that it could be something more. I told her about the back-breaking work of cleaning it out myself, the blisters, the exhaustion, the thrill of signing the first mortgage. I told her about the first tenant and the first rent check. I told her about the mistakes, the deals that went bad, the partners who betrayed me, the times I was nearly bankrupt. I told her about Eleanor, how she believed in me when I was just a rough, ambitious man with dirt under his fingernails and a fire in his belly. I talked 4 hours. She listened. She didn't take notes. She just absorbed it. The next time she visited, she had questions, smart questions, about leverage, about property valuation, about managing contractors. She had been doing her homework. The visits became a routine. Twice, sometimes 3 times a week, we stopped talking about the past and started talking about the present. I showed her the ledgers, the real ones, the ones Arthur managed. I explained the portfolio, the commercial properties, the residential blocks, the land holdings. I walked her through the finances, the income, the expenses, the taxes. I didn't treat her like a granddaughter. I treated her like an apprentice. She was a quick study. She had a mind for it, a natural intuition for numbers and risk that reminded me of myself. But she had something I never had, a sense of compassion. She asked about the tenants, about the communities. She talked about sustainable investing, about green buildings, about things I'd never considered. She wasn't just seeing buildings. She was seeing homes and businesses. She was seeing a legacy that wasn't just financial, but social. The seasons turned. My health, as the doctor had predicted, began its slow, inevitable decline. The walks in the garden grew shorter. The naps grew longer. But the afternoons with Emily were the brightest part of my week. One afternoon, almost a year to the day after the infamous dinner, we were in the study. She was going over a proposal for the refurbishment of one of our older apartment complexes. I was dozing in my chair. I woke to find her not looking at the papers, but at the portrait of Eleanor over the fireplace. She was beautiful, Emily said softly. She was, I agreed, inside and out. I think I understand now, Emily said, turning to look at me. Her face was calm, thoughtful. Why you did it. The token, I mean. It wasn't just to punish them. No, I said. It wasn't. It was a filter, she said. It was designed to catch the greedy, to make sure they revealed themselves so you could rule them out. But it was also designed to, she searched for the word, to not catch the one who wasn't, the one who would see it for what it was and give it back. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She saw the confirmation in my eyes. She smiled, a small, sad smile. You gambled everything on a single moment, on a single gesture. The greatest fortunes often do, I said, repeating Mark's foolish words back to her. But now they held a different, truer meaning. They rest on a moment of luck, or of grace. I called for Arthur the next day. With Emily as a witness, I signed a final, addendum letter. It was not a legal document, but a personal one, addressed to Arthur as trustee. In it, I outlined my observations. I stated my unequivocal belief that Emily was the only one with the character, the intellect, and the integrity to eventually succeed me as the head of the trust. I told him that when the time came, he should have no doubts. The interview was over. She had passed. I died a month later. It was a quiet end. In my sleep, in my own bed. The house was quiet. There was no drama, no deathbed reconciliation. It was just over. The reading of the will was, by all accounts, the stuff of legend. Arthur told me about it later, relishing the telling, They had all gathered in his office. Alistair, Mark, Sarah, Thomas, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. They knew about the stipends, of course, but a part of them still held out hope that the old man had relented at the end. Arthur read the will, his voice dry and precise. He outlined the trust, the stipends, the interim clause. The air grew thick with their suppressed fury. It was a gilded cage, and they all knew it. Then he read the final part, the part about the trusteeship, the power to appoint a successor. He didn't name me. He simply stated that the trustee had, after a period of observation and assessment, made his decision. He then looked up from the document and directly at Emily, who was sitting quietly in the corner, separate from them. "Miss Emily O'Connell," he said, "the trust would like to offer you the position of managing director and successor trustee. The salary is substantial. The responsibilities are immense. The learning curve will be vertical. Do you accept?" Arthur said the look on their faces was worth every penny of his fee. The dawning, horrified comprehension that not only were they sidelined, but that the quiet, mousy one they had always overlooked was being handed the keys to the kingdom. The injustice of it was too much for them to bear, but they were trapped. They couldn't say a word. They couldn't challenge it. They could only sit there, their faces purple with rage, and watch as Emily, calm and poised, nodded. "Yes, Mr. Graves," she said, "I accept." She told me later that she walked out of that office, past her spluttering, impotent family, and went straight to the cemetery. She stood before the simple, elegant headstone I share with Eleanor. She didn't say anything. She just stood there for a long time. Then she reached into her pocket and took out the carnival token. She'd had it cleaned and polished. The star shone brightly. She bent down and laid it carefully on the grass at the base of the headstone. "Good for one lucky break," she whispered. "You gave me mine. Thank you, grandfather." Then she turned and walked away, towards the empire she would now build in her own image, not from mud and willpower, but from the ashes of greed, on a foundation of second chances. And I knew, with a certainty that was my final, perfect peace, that it was in the best possible hands.